Hey guys, tonight we step into something quieter than your phone screen, deeper than your weekend plans, and brace yourself, way more valuable than whatever's waiting in your Amazon cart. Tonight we're talking about treasure, not the sparkly kind, not the kind that sits in banks or comes with a yacht. We're going after something far older, far wiser, and far more dangerous, the true treasure that only Christ can offer. You know, the kind of treasure that actually stays with you. But let's be real for a second. Most of us wouldn't know true treasure if it tap danced on the coffee table. Because modern life is a thunderstorm of pings, deadlines, perfectly curated banana bread reels, and spiritual static. You probably won't survive this noise without losing part of your soul, or at least misplacing it under a pile of unread emails and urgent updates. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love knowing where in the world you're tuning in from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're lying there, blinking up at a ceiling that knows your doubts too well. Maybe your body is still, but your mind is pacing. Because something's off. Your life looks fine on paper, decent job, decent place, maybe even decent people, but something deeper is aching. Like a hunger that cereal can't fix. You shuffle through your memories, searching for when the restlessness started. Maybe it was at that wedding last month, watching the couple dance while something inside you whispered, "Is this all there is?" Or maybe it was at the grocery store, standing in line while a toddler screamed and someone behind you muttered about how everyone's lost it. Maybe it was just this morning, brushing your teeth, staring at your own eyes in the mirror and not quite recognizing them. You try distracting yourself with something shiny. Retail therapy, doom scrolling, 3 consecutive episodes of that show everyone's fake laughing at online. But after the pixels fade and the sugar crash hits, you're still here, empty-ish, a little too aware of your own breath, a little too quiet inside. It's here, in this stillness, that something ancient stirs. You remember stories about treasure, real treasure. The kind you don't chase, the kind you uncover. The kind buried in fields, and whispered about by old prophets, and tired fishermen, with calloused hands and open hearts. You remember that Jesus said something weird once, "Where your treasure is, there your heart will be also." But what if your heart feels scattered? What if it's split between ambition, fear, comfort, and caffeine? What if your treasure isn't even treasure, just stuff you were told to want? Here's the crazy thing. People have always struggled with this. In the 12th century, a French abbot named Bernard of Clairvaux wrote about love's disordered, how the human heart tends to love lesser things too much and greater things too little. Historians still argue whether Bernard's mysticism helped or hurt the church long term. But one thing's for sure. The man understood yearning. So you sit, and you whisper something out loud that sounds suspiciously like prayer. Not the kind you recite before dinner. The kind that leaks from the cracks of your own soul. God, if you're real, if you're still listening, show me something worth chasing, show me what matters. That's where the treasure map begins. Not with fireworks or angel choirs. With that small, honest ache. Now let's make something clear. The world will sell you its treasures, with flashing lights and impossible abs. But those treasures? They don't come cheap. Not in money, but in soul erosion. Because with every scroll and comparison, every must-have that fades into boredom, you lose a piece of your inner clarity. You become a collector of shiny nothings. Here's a fringe historical tidbit for you. In 1849, during the California gold rush, some hopeful miners were so desperate for treasure that they followed fool's gold, pyrite, right into debt, starvation, and death. One guy famously tried to eat it, thinking maybe it held some kind of sustaining property. Spoiler, it didn't. We haven't changed much, have we? But tonight you're not panning through mud, you're praying through stillness, you're not chasing fool's gold, you're waiting on the one who says he is the treasure. And here's what's wild. Christ doesn't say find me and you'll be rich. He says lose your life and you'll find it. Which sounds, frankly, like terrible marketing. But also kind of beautiful. Like maybe the way out of your restlessness isn't more, but less. Not hustle, but surrender. The world shouts, climb higher. Christ whispers, come lower. So here you are, on a Tuesday night or a Sunday morning, or whenever this finds you, slowly realizing that treasure isn't something you stack, it's someone you seek. And tonight you're daring to ask the right question. What if I'm made for more than comfort and convenience? What if I'm made for Christ? Now don't freak out, but that question, it's already treasure. Not because it gives you answers, but because it means your soul's awake. And when the soul wakes up, things start to change. You won't notice it at first. You'll still misplace your keys and roll your eyes at TikTok trends. But underneath all that, quietly, steadily, a new kind of longing will grow. Not a greedy one, a holy one. The kind that's patient and gentle and stubborn in the best way. So close your eyes, if you haven't already. Let the ache remain. It's not a flaw, it's a compass. And we've only just started. You stir beneath the hum of your ceiling fan, the room just cool enough to let your thoughts drift. That quiet ache? Still there. Not overwhelming, just faithful. Like a bell that won't stop ringing in the distance. You don't run from it tonight, you let it echo. Because maybe, just maybe, that ache is what real treasure feels like before it's found. You think about how often people chase the wrong things. And not just people on TV with private jets and problematic scandals. Regular people, good people, people like you. You've chased things before too. Acceptance, attention, achievements. Maybe you even caught a few. Held them like precious stones, showed them off, let them sit on your shelf. But deep down, you knew. That shimmer faded faster than your last vacation tan. The Apostle Paul, yes, that Paul, the guy who used to imprison Christians and then wrote most of the New Testament, he gets this. He literally says in Philippians, I consider everything a loss because of the surpassing worth of knowing Christ Jesus my Lord. Everything, loss. Not because he was dramatic, but because, once you taste the real treasure, the rest tastes like dust. Paul had status, education, influence. Roman and Jewish society both respected him, and yet, he walked away from all of it, to follow a crucified carpenter. Historians still argue whether Paul's radical shift destabilized traditional Judaism, or actually preserved something deeper. But either way, his heart found what yours is now starting to hunger for, the real thing. And let's talk about that word for a second, real. You're living in a time where everything's curated, photos, conversations, even vulnerabilities are filtered for effect. But real treasure can't be photoshopped. It can't be sponsored. It definitely doesn't have a hashtag, which is why the prayer forming in your chest tonight doesn't need fancy words. It just needs truth. Something like, Jesus, strip away what's fake in me. Help me want what you want. Show me the treasure I keep ignoring. There's courage in that prayer. Quiet, trembling courage. Because real treasure. It usually requires some digging, some letting go. Some clearing out of old junk you forgot you were still carrying. Naya. That's how ancient monks used to pray. In silence. With nothing but their breath and the name of Christ on their lips. Some would go into the desert for weeks, hoping to empty themselves enough to hear God clearly. A few may have gone a little too far. One guy famously lived on top of a pillar for 37 years. Historians still debate if it was devotion or madness. Either way, the desire was clear, to get closer to the treasure. But tonight, you don't need a desert, just honesty, just breath, just stillness. And maybe a little humor too, because, let's be real, you'd last like 14 minutes on a pillar. 15, if they let you bring snacks. So instead of extremes, you turn inward. You open your clenched spiritual fists and whisper again, help me want what you want. That's when you start noticing things, like how your daily routines, commute, emails, laundry, repeat, have been trying to hush your soul. How you've trained yourself to move fast, stay distracted, and avoid silence. Because silence gets weird, too quiet, too revealing. But that's also where treasure starts to shimmer, just beneath the noise. You think of the parable again. A man finds treasure in a field. He sells everything he has, and buys the field. Everything. That part always used to scare you a little. Everything? But now, it sounds more like relief. Like he didn't lose. He traded up. You start to wonder what your field looks like. What's Christ asking you to give up? Not out of guilt, but out of invitation. What's the clutter that's keeping you from the treasure? Maybe it's control. Or approval. Or the myth of always being okay. Maybe it's that image you're trying to maintain, the one where you're competent, confident, and never cry during Pixar movies. No judgment. Up ruined everyone. So you sit there, a little braver than before, asking, what if I let go? And in that question, you feel something shift. You're not alone in this, you know. The early church wrestled with these same things. Wealth, fear, image. That's why Jesus told the rich young ruler to sell everything. Not because money is evil, but because that guy trusted it more than he trusted God. Historians still argue whether he ever came back, whether he ever gave it up. But the warning stands. You can't carry both the treasure of the world and the treasure of Christ. They don't fit in the same backpack. So you begin to lay things down, not all at once, not with fanfare, just quietly, between prayers. A few false idols here, a few ego addictions there. You notice how light your soul starts to feel, like you've been lugging around a suitcase of bricks labeled "Impress them" and "Don't fail" and "Smile more." And maybe, just maybe, that ache is starting to shift, less like hunger, more like hope. It's slow, gentle, like dawn sneaking in through your blinds. But it's happening. A pull towards something deeper, a craving for simplicity, presence, eternity. You don't have all the answers. You're not floating 3 feet above your bed in mystical bliss. You're still just you. But now, you're a version of you that's praying in secret. A version that knows there's treasure buried just beneath the soil of this ordinary life. And you're ready to dig. So you dig. Not with shovels or pickaxes, though, let's be honest, if spiritual treasure required Home Depot gear, you'd probably still show up, receipts in hand. No, this kind of digging happens slowly, from the inside out. It starts when you sit in that uncomfortable silence long enough to stop filling it. When you stop editing your prayers before you pray them, you begin to pray differently, not better necessarily, just realer. More like, God, I'm not even sure what I'm asking for, but I know I need you more than I need anything else. Which is dangerously close to what the psalmist meant when he wrote, "Whom have I in heaven but you, and earth has nothing I desire besides you." And that's a big shift. Because, let's be honest, the earth has a lot of desirable stuff. Soft hoodies, chocolate-covered almonds, Wi-Fi. But when you start seeing Christ as the only treasure, not just the biggest or best one, everything else kind of loses its grip. You begin to realize you've been praying for treasure like it's a job promotion, or a perfectly aged cheese, or a breakthrough that would finally make people say, wow, you've made it. But treasure in Christ doesn't always sparkle in public. Sometimes it just sits quietly in the corner, waiting for you to notice. Like Brother Lawrence, that 17th century monk who found profound joy scrubbing dishes in a monastery kitchen. No big sermons, no spotlight. Just simple, persistent awareness of God, in the most mundane moments. Historians still argue whether his letters were edited to make him seem holier than he really was, but even if they were, the idea still stands. Treasure isn't just in mountaintop moments, it's in burnt toast and dirty laundry too. You start looking at your day differently, that annoying meeting, an invitation to humility, that person who always one-ups your stories, an opportunity to die to ego. That parking space you didn't get, okay, maybe just a chance to practice patience, or scream into your steering wheel with Christian restraint. This is what real treasure does. It reorders your desires, like a compass slowly swinging toward true north, even if it trembles on the way there, and you start to feel it. That hunger, less for solutions and more for presence, less for the miracle, more for the miracle giver. And still, you keep praying. Not because you're good at it now, but because you know it's where the digging happens. You whisper, Lord, help me want you, more than I want resolution. Which is wild. Right? Because most of your prayers, up until now, have probably been for something. Healing, clarity, escape. And now, you're just praying for Him. His nearness, His voice, His joy. That's when you remember something weird from history class. How early Christian martyrs used to sing while being led to their deaths. Not because they were pain immune, spoiler, they weren't, but because they knew what they were dying for. a treasure nothing could steal. Historians still debate whether all those stories were exaggerated to inspire courage, but one thing's certain, those believers weren't clinging to comfort. They were clinging to Christ, and you're not facing lions in an arena, you're facing your inbox, your taxes, your insecurities, but the same treasure waits. You start to let the gospel touch areas you've tried to keep walled off. That anxious spiral that always kicks in at 2:43 a.m.? Bring it to him. That habit you swore you'd break in January 3 Januaries ago? Invite him into it. That grudge that's been quietly rotting in your chest like forgotten leftovers in the back of the fridge? Yeah. That one too. Because here's the thing. True treasure isn't guarded by gates. It's guarded by surrender. And the more you surrender, your expectations, your timelines, your backup plans, the more space you make for God to show you what's actually worth keeping. Like peace. Not the spa day kind, but the deep, unshakable peace that lets you exhale even when the answers don't come. Like joy. Not the fake it till you make it grin, but the kind of joy that dances barefoot in a rainstorm and doesn't care who's watching. And like love. The kind that doesn't wait for you to be polished and put together. The kind that kneels down beside your mess, lifts your chin, and says, I want you. You stop trying to earn that love. You just let it wreck you, in the best way. Let it undo your performance. Let it fill the rooms in you that success could never reach. And here's a plot twist. The more you treasure Christ, the more you treasure people. Not because they're useful, not because they validate you, but because they're His. Because their stories matter. Because loving them becomes another way of loving Him. That's why your prayers start to include more names. Not just yours. You whisper blessings over friends, enemies, exes. People you haven't thought about in years suddenly drift into your thoughts. And instead of scrolling past, you pray. You're becoming a different kind of person. Not overnight, not without resistance, but steadily. Like roots going deep. Like light filtering through thick forest. And the ache? It's still there. But now it feels like part of the invitation. A reminder that you were made for more than scrolling and striving and surviving. You were made for treasure. And you're getting closer. You open your eyes one morning and something shifted. Not drastically, not like a firework or a dream that yanks you out of sleep, but subtly, like the way light creeps into a room through old blinds. You're still in the same house, same town, same life, but now everything hums a little differently. You notice things. The neighbor's overgrown roses bursting through the fence like they're auditioning for a perfume ad. The quiet clink of your spoon in the cereal bowl. Even your dog's nose, wet and curious, pushing into your hand like, hey, I was made by God too, you know. And that's when it hits you. Treasure doesn't just come wrapped in revelation. Sometimes it comes disguised as Tuesday. It's in that slow sip of lukewarm coffee, when the verse you read last week suddenly loops back into your head. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field. You pause, think, wonder why Jesus didn't say it's like treasure on display in a glass case. No, it's hidden. And you only find it when you go digging through the ordinary. The coffee. Historians still argue whether the field in that parable symbolized Israel, or the world, or just a metaphorical Costco of spiritual depth. But maybe the point isn't where the field is. It's that someone thought the treasure was worth everything. Worth selling the house. Worth changing plans. Worth looking like a total fool to everyone else. And now you see it. Your life, your work, even your weird laundry pile. They're fields. Not glamorous. Not obvious. But holy ground all the same. And you're learning to kneel on it. Even when your knees creak a little. You find yourself praying more spontaneously. Not in a schedule-bound, checklist kind of way, but like bursts of honesty bubbling up during traffic, grocery runs, or mid-sentence in awkward conversations. Jesus, be with me. Jesus, give me eyes to see. Jesus, help me not lose it on this customer service representative. These are not polished prayers, but they're gold, because now you're less interested in sounding holy, and more interested in being held. Less concerned about how you look, and more about where He is. And you know what? That's treasure too. Take Francis of Assisi for example. The guy literally stripped naked in public to reject his wealthy inheritance. Bold move. Also, do not try that at home. He gave up material riches to live among the poor, believing that Christ was most clearly seen in the lowly and forgotten. Some say he was just dramatic. Some call him a spiritual genius. Historians still debate whether his mental health played a role in his choices. But regardless, Francis knew something. You don't find treasure unless you let go of what's keeping your hands full. And you've got stuff to let go of too. Expectations. Regrets. A mental list of people who still owe you an apology. You start to hand them over, not because it's easy, but because your hands are tired. You notice your prayers shift again. They're less, God fix this, and more, God form me. Less change them, and more change me. It's humbling, and strangely peaceful. Like watching a tide roll in, and realizing you don't have to outrun it. You can just float. You're not floating alone either. You start seeing other treasure hunters around you. Quiet people who radiate contentment in ways that feel rare in the age of hustle. That older woman who prays under her breath at the bus stop. The barista who remembers your name and your oat milk preference. The friend who texts, praying for you and actually means it. You begin to treasure them, not as solutions or saviors, but as signposts. Reminders that God's kingdom shows up in the strangest places. The back row. The recovery meeting. The midnight phone call. It's also in history if you know where to look. Did you know early Irish monks used to pray in these tiny rock huts called beehive cells? Wind-whipped lonely places on the edge of the world, where they believed they could hear God better. Some people think it was excessive, maybe even escapist. Historians still argue whether their isolation was prophetic, or just a bit much. But those huts stand as weird little reminders. Sometimes you have to step way off the beaten path to rediscover what's sacred. And no, you don't need to move to a beehive cell. But maybe you do need to step away from the noise sometimes. Turn off the algorithm. Say no to one more obligation. Sit with that uncomfortable stillness and just say, Jesus, I'm here. I don't have anything fancy to bring, but I'm here. He hears that, every time. And slowly your life becomes less about building castles, and more about uncovering wells. Less about securing your future, and more about surrendering your now. Because when Christ becomes your treasure, your definition of success starts sounding suspiciously like peace. Not perfection, not applause, just peace. The kind that sneaks into your bones. The kind that lets you sleep a little deeper, laugh a little louder, and show up even when you're unsure. Because you know who holds the map. You know where the treasure is buried. Or maybe, just maybe, you're starting to realize it's already inside you. You lie there, eyes half closed, thinking about that inner treasure, the one Jesus keeps whispering about like a secret too sacred to shout. And now, more than ever, you want to find it. But here's the twist no one warns you about. When you pray for treasure, Jesus doesn't always hand you a map. Sometimes he hands you a shovel. So you start digging. Not in a literal pirate on a beach kind of way, though that would be dramatically satisfying, but through the crusty, dry layers of your own assumptions. Your old patterns. Your sacred cows, and maybe even your morning routine. Because, let's be real, doom scrolling in bed isn't exactly soul fertilizer. The digging's not glamorous. Some days, it's you in sweatpants whispering, God, I'm tired, for the 5th time before breakfast. Other days, it's forcing yourself to pause before reacting, even though sarcasm is your spiritual gift. You're in good company. Paul was definitely spicy. And as you dig, you realize something. Prayer isn't about magic words. It's about presence. It's about holding space long enough for God to meet you in the mess, not the Pinterest, perfect version of your faith. Did you know that in the 14th century, a mysterious English mystic wrote a book called The Cloud of Unknowing? No one knows who penned it. Historians still debate whether it was a monk, a nun, or some medieval introvert who hated small talk. But the whole book was basically a spiritual guide to letting go of thinking about God, and instead just being with God. Yeah, deep stuff. You try it. You sit there, hands open, letting the silence hum louder than your worries. It's awkward at first. Your brain keeps throwing out grocery lists and weird memories from middle school, but you keep at it, and slowly, something begins to soften. You start seeing prayer less like a vending machine, and more like a slow-cooked stew. It takes time, ingredients, heat. But eventually, the flavors deepen. The aroma spreads. And you realize, you're not hungry for answers, you're hungry for God. You remember how Jesus told people not to store up treasures on earth where moth and rust destroy, because rust always wins. Unless you're a museum conservator, in which case, respect. And yet, the things you've clung to, success, reputation, your curated online aesthetic, they've got rust fingerprints all over them. You're learning to loosen your grip. Not to be careless, but to be free. That freedom leads you to dangerous prayers. Ones like, break me, or teach me to need you, or, the scariest of all, do whatever it takes. People in history prayed like that too. Take Dietrich Bonhoeffer, German pastor, resistor of the Nazis, and all-around brave soul. He once said, when Christ calls a man he bids him come and die. Cheerful bedtime quote, right? But Bonhoeffer wasn't trying to scare anyone. He just knew that real treasure doesn't come without sacrifice. He died in a concentration camp for his faith, but his words still echo because they were rooted in eternal gold. You're not being asked to die, at least not physically, but you are being asked to lay some things down, like pride, or comfort. Or the fantasy that your life should unfold like a perfectly edited highlight reel, and that surrender. It's wild. Because the less you clutch at control, the more peace you find in simply being held, even when nothing changes, even when it hurts. That's when the treasure starts glowing through the cracks. And don't worry, you're not becoming some super spiritual monk. You're still fully human, occasionally grumpy, occasionally hilarious, often reaching for your phone 5 seconds after saying Amen, but now you're different. Not because you've arrived, but because you're aware, awake, tuned to a frequency that most people miss in the static. It's like tuning an old radio, that delicate twist of the dial until suddenly, boom, there's the voice, clear, calm and unmistakably not your own. Jesus, speaking not through thunder or trending hashtags, but through the small, consistent rhythm of your daily surrender. So you pray again. Not louder, but deeper. Jesus, help me treasure you more than being understood. Jesus, help me love you more than my image. Jesus, help me want you, even when I don't feel you. And yeah, you still have questions. Historians still argue whether Jesus' parables were designed to reveal or confuse. But you're less bothered now. Because you've seen enough to know that truth doesn't always come neatly wrapped. Sometimes it's buried beneath layers of waiting, wondering, and walking forward anyway. Like those 17th century pilgrims who crossed oceans on cramped ships, chasing freedom and a future they couldn't fully see. Most of them never found riches. But they found purpose. Found each other, found God in the wind and sea spray. You're a pilgrim too. And the treasure isn't far, it's just deeper. And so, shovel in hand, heart slightly raw, you keep digging. Not to earn God's love, but because you finally realized you already have it. You wake up the next morning, maybe a little puffy-eyed, definitely coffee-dependent, and realize that this whole finding true treasure in Christ thing is less of a one-time discovery and more of a lifelong excavation. But here's the twist no one puts on a bumper sticker. Sometimes, finding treasure means losing everything else first. You drag your thoughts back to Matthew chapter 13 verse 44, the verse that sparked all this. You know the one. The kingdom of heaven is like treasure hidden in a field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has, and buys that field. Read that again. In his joy. Not in obligation, not in martyr mode. Not in a, well I guess I have to sigh. The guy was thrilled to give up everything. Why? Because he knew the field was worth it. But here's where it gets spicy. You're not told what he had to sell. Maybe it was easy stuff, old habits, mismatched socks, half-baked plans. But maybe it was things he loved. Maybe it was the approval of his friends. Maybe it was the future he thought he deserved. Historians still argue whether the parable hints at a specific cultural practice of hidden treasure during wartime, or whether Jesus just had a flair for metaphors that hit like a well-aimed sandal. Either way, the message is clear. The treasure costs something. But it's worth everything. And now, the reality check settles in like the thud of your Bible hitting the nightstand. You want that kind of joy. You want to give everything for Jesus. But you're not sure you can. Welcome to the club. Even Peter, the bold walking on water fisherman, panicked and sank when things got real. Even Paul had a thorn in his flesh that wouldn't budge. Even Mother Teresa went through years of spiritual dryness that made her question everything she ever believed. Bet they didn't mention that in Sunday school. You're not failing because you're struggling, you're growing, so you whisper it again like a mantra, like a lifeline. Jesus, I want to want you. And that's enough for today. You start looking at your life differently now. Every small moment becomes a chance to choose the treasure again. To let go of the glittery distractions and hold onto the solid gold. Like when you get cut off in traffic and instead of muttering something unholy, you breathe out grace, mostly for yourself. Or when your plans crumble, and instead of spiraling into despair, you remind your anxious brain, God's got this timeline, I don't have to. Or when you see someone else thriving, and you're tempted to measure your worth by their success, you whisper, Jesus is enough, even here. You laugh more too, because honestly, this journey's absurd sometimes. Like how medieval monks used to write marginalia in their Bibles, little doodles in the corners, like cats chasing mice, or knights fighting snails. Historians still can't explain the obsession with snails. Maybe it was some passive-aggressive metaphor for sin. And maybe that's the point. That even in holy places there's room for humor. For humanity. For being a total mess, and still being fully loved. You start to see how even the hard stuff, the heartbreaks, the loneliness, the prayers that go unanswered, can be part of the treasure hunt. Because sometimes, Jesus hides gold inside the dirt. Like Corrie ten Boom once said after surviving a concentration camp, there is no pit so deep that God's love is not deeper still. And that quote? It stays with you. Especially on the nights you cry for no clear reason, or the days you stare blankly at the sky and think, what am I even doing? Because the answer is this. You're digging. Still. Even now, you're learning to pray not just to get through life, but to walk with God in it. To find Him in grocery store lines and heartbreak songs, and the smell of your grandmother's house. You're learning to trust that sometimes, the greatest spiritual victories are the quietest, the ones no one sees. The ones that look like you choosing to believe, even when nothing makes sense, and when the doubts come, because, oh they will, you stop pretending they're poison. You hold them up to the light and let Jesus examine them with you, like a child handing her broken toy to her dad and asking, can you fix it? Because He can. And He will. You think of all the saints and sinners before you. Augustine with his party boy past, C.S. Lewis with his reluctant conversion, and that one disciple who just went by the other Judas. Tough PR gig. None of them were perfect, but they found the treasure. Or rather, the treasure found them. And now, in the quiet flicker of your bedside lamp, you realize something outrageous. You're already richer than you ever imagined. Because this whole time, while you were searching, Jesus was holding you. Through the confusion, through the compromise, through the comedy of your best efforts. He's not waiting for the polished version of you to show up. He's treasure hunting too, and He chose you. So you smile, maybe even chuckle. Because in a world obsessed with owning things, you're learning to be owned by love, by grace, by a King who gave up everything just to call you His. And that's the kind of treasure no moth, rust, or trending TikTok sound can touch. Your alarm goes off too early again. The kind of early that feels criminal. But somehow, through the haze of pillow creases and the scent of yesterday's coffee in your breath, there's this subtle, ridiculous joy. You drag yourself up, not because you're a morning person, let's not flatter ourselves, but because something in your bones is starting to believe this life has more meaning than whatever's trending on your feed. You whisper it like you're warming up the engine. Jesus, show me the treasure today. The day unspools like a threadbare sweater. Emails, deadlines, a half-hearted salad. But underneath it all, you're watching, listening, tuning in like it's some sacred frequency you've only just discovered. And somewhere between the third errand and the sixth group chat notification, you start noticing something strange. The treasure isn't there. It's here. In the interruptions. In the inconvenient kindness. In the awkward grace-laced pause before you clap back in a text. It's hiding in plain sight. Historians still argue whether early Celtic Christians really believed that heaven and earth were separated only by a thin place. A barely there veil where God feels startlingly near. Whether or not it's historically provable, the idea sticks to your soul like peanut butter to the roof of your mouth. Because, honestly, some moments do feel like that. Like the time you helped your neighbor carry groceries, and she told you about her mother's cancer. Or the way a child's laugh cuts through your cynicism, like a hot knife through refrigerated butter. Or the time you sat in your parked car after a terrible day and still whispered, "Thank you." There's treasure tucked in those cracks. And now prayer becomes less of a formality, and more like texting your best friend, who also incidentally built the cosmos. You find yourself saying things like, "Okay, God, I'm gonna need you not to let me slap anyone today." And you swear, just maybe, you hear a divine chuckle in response. You used to think prayer was supposed to sound holy, like Gregorian chant holy. Now it sounds more like, "Lord, I'm trying not to be petty, but wow, they are testing me today." And that counts. Even monks didn't always get it right. Did you know medieval nuns used to secretly adopt stray cats and smuggle them into their cloisters? There's even a 15th century manuscript with cat paw prints, literally pressed into the ink. Apparently, even in silence and solitude, they couldn't resist a good cuddle. Holiness, it turns out, isn't allergic to mess. Neither is treasure. And you realize, maybe the real question isn't, how do I find Christ? Maybe it's, how do I notice him when he shows up in my Tuesday afternoon meltdown, or my Wednesday night laundry pile? Because sometimes Jesus doesn't knock politely. Sometimes he barges in with the scent of burnt popcorn, and a reminder that the kingdom of heaven looks less like a throne room, and more like a break room with flickering fluorescent lights. You start seeing him in your lack, in your hunger, not just for food, but for meaning, for intimacy, for realness. And instead of numbing it with the next distraction, you invite him in. You light a candle, not because it's magic, but because sometimes your soul needs a symbol. You put your phone on Do Not Disturb, and let your own heart disturb you instead. You say, "Jesus, what are you trying to show me?" And you wait. The world doesn't explode. There's no angel with a flaming sword. Just quiet, just your heartbeat, just the tiny ache of awareness that maybe, just maybe, you've been walking through treasure this whole time, and only now are your eyes adjusting to the glint. Historians still debate whether early desert hermits were escaping persecution, or just spiritually introverted. But one thing's for sure, they went out into the wilderness expecting to find God, and surprise, he showed up. In scorpions, in dry wind, in the gnawing hunger that taught them how to feast on grace. And you? You're not in a desert, you're in a traffic jam, or a staff meeting, or your messy kitchen. But the principle holds. If God is who he says he is, then there's no such thing as an ordinary day. You start catching yourself mid-grumble, mid-sigh, mid-panic spiral. And instead of spiraling further, you whisper, "Help me see the treasure here." Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But the point isn't perfection. It's presence. You're not here to win spiritual gold stars. You're here to dig, to be awake, to walk through your day with pockets full of little prayers and hands open wide, ready to receive. And you know what? You're doing better than you think. You start seeing how the people around you are treasure too. Even the ones who make you want to scream into a pillow. Especially those, because if Christ lives in you, then he might just be hiding in them too, underneath the sarcasm, behind the bad attitude, beneath the pain they won't show. And now, your prayer shifts again. Jesus, help me treasure them like you treasure me. Oof. That's a dangerous one. But it's also the gateway to the kind of love that flips tables and washes feet and forgives 70 times 7. And in the stillness of that prayer, in the absurd risk of asking God to soften your heart for others, something inside you cracks open. In the best way, you feel it. Not a flash of lightning, not a divine spotlight, just a slow, sacred thaw, like ice melting under a spring sun. The treasure is here. And you are finally learning how to see it. You're still not quite sure how it happened. But suddenly, you're having conversations with God that feel natural. Like you're not auditioning for sainthood, just finally being honest. You start praying about things that seem way too small to bother him with. Like your dying houseplant, or the fact that your jeans feel a little too tight lately, or your irrational fear of sending voice messages. And still, somehow you sense him listening. There's this quiet revolution taking place in your soul. Nothing flashy, no grand announcements. Just a slow-burning conviction that the real treasure in Christ isn't something you earn, win, or decode. It's something you notice, something you receive. The irony is, the more you chase after him with your plans and spreadsheets and color-coded devotionals, the more he seems to show up in the in-between spaces. The forgotten corners, the accidents. You read about St. Francis of Assisi, the guy who preached to birds and once allegedly tamed a wolf. Historians still argue whether that wolf story was metaphor or miracle, but either way, Francis understood something we often forget. Everything is sacred when Christ is at the center. Even the wolves, and now you're walking your own tightrope between the sacred and the mundane. You're in line at the pharmacy, your phone's on 3%, your patience is on fumes, and suddenly you feel it again. That whisper, that soft tug on your attention. Treasure is here, right now. Look closer. You glance up. The woman behind the counter has tired eyes, but she smiles anyway. You smile back. It's not revolutionary, but it's real. And in that exchange, in the shared humanity of it, something divine sneaks through. You realize that the real power of prayer isn't always about changing what happens. It's about changing how you see what's already happening. It's like those old stereograms. You know, those pixelated magic eye posters from the 90s, where if you unfocused your eyes just right, a 3D dolphin or spaceship would pop out. For the longest time you'd stare, frustrated, thinking, there's nothing there, and then, bam, it appears. Prayer is that unfocusing, that surrender, that weird moment where you stop squinting and just let go. It's uncomfortable, it's humbling, but oh, when it happens, when the veil lifts and you glimpse Jesus right there in the ordinary, it undoes you. You start praying in places you didn't expect. In the shower, while brushing your teeth, over your inbox, before replying to that text. You start making weird deals with God like, okay, if I get this parking spot, I'll actually read Leviticus tonight. And then laughing at yourself, because you know he's not a vending machine, and yet, he still seems to enjoy the conversation. Your prayers are messy, sometimes sarcastic, often unfiltered. You pray while cooking pasta, you pray while folding laundry, you pray while doom-scrolling. And shocker, God doesn't leave the chat. You think about Brother Lawrence, a 17th century monk who believed the presence of God could be found while scrubbing pots. Historians still debate how literal his practicing the presence of God was. Was he actually spiritually ecstatic over dishwater? Or was he just finding a way to survive monastic chores? Either way, it works. And now you too are scrubbing, folding, replying, driving, with an eye on the divine. You begin to understand something dangerous and beautiful. Prayer is not an escape hatch from the world, it's a keyhole view into how the world was meant to be. You notice people, like, really notice them. You start praying mid-conversation, not aloud, just silently, under your breath. A whisper of, God, help me love them well. You're becoming the kind of person who sees others as sacred vessels, not just background characters in your personal movie. And that's when it hits you. Treasure isn't hidden from you, it's hidden for you. It's in the verse you've read 100 times, and only now understand. It's in the tears you didn't expect to cry during that worship song. It's in the quiet conviction to apologize first, even when you weren't technically wrong. It's in the way you've started trusting again, hoping again, asking again. Even the doubts feel different now. Softer. Less like enemies, more like aching questions. God is big enough to hold. You start seeing the fruit. Not always dramatic, not always Instagram-worthy, but real. Peace that doesn't make sense. Joy that sneaks in sideways. Patience that shocks even you. And a growing awareness that everything is connected. You begin praying before the storm hits, not just after. You begin thanking Him before the blessing drops, not just after. You begin trusting Him in the confusion, not just when clarity finally arrives like a delayed Amazon package. You no longer view prayer as your spiritual emergency lever. It's your breathing, your rhythm, your anchor, and even when you forget, and oh, you will, you now know the way back, you simply whisper, Jesus, where are you in this? And He's there, always has been, not with neon signs or thunderclaps, but in the crumbs and quiet, in the unseen places, in the love that costs you something. And slowly, day by day, your heart is becoming the kind of soil that can recognize treasure when it brushes your fingertips. Because treasure, it turns out, isn't rare. It's just rarely seen. Somewhere along the way, without even noticing it, you stop asking God for gold and start asking Him for glasses. Not literal ones, though that wouldn't hurt during your third reread of Leviticus, but a different kind of sight. Spiritual clarity, depth perception for the soul, the ability to see what matters before it breaks, not just after the pieces scatter across the floor. You find yourself praying weird prayers like, "Help me see people the way you see them," and then immediately regretting it because, oh no, now you do. Now you're noticing pain behind sarcasm, insecurity behind bravado, loneliness hidden in polished Instagram captions. It's a blessing. And a bit of a trap, because once you see treasure in others, especially the ones you've written off, it's hard to unsee it. You remember Zacchaeus, the short tax collector who climbed a tree just to glimpse Jesus. Historians still argue whether he was short in stature or small in reputation, a phrase that could have implied social outcast. Either way, Jesus sees him, calls him down, dines at his house, declares, "Salvation has come here." And it's not just about the meal, it's about being seen. So now, you're climbing your own emotional sycamore trees, awkward, splintery, public, risking vulnerability just for a clearer view. And from up here, the kingdom of God looks nothing like the maps you drew in Sunday school. It's wider, messier, full of people you'd never invite to dinner, and yet God already has. You start praying not just for treasure, but to become it. Not treasure that glitters, but treasure that grounds, that feeds the hungry, sits with the grieving, makes room at the table for someone who still smells like pigsty shame. The world, by the way, is not impressed. It still markets treasure as success, status, and serotonin in a box. It still flashes 20-second dopamine hits and tells you that your worth is tied to how fast you can produce, or how loudly you can post. But your prayers are changing the algorithm of your heart. You find yourself slowing down, choosing obscurity over applause, choosing silence over retaliation, choosing, brace yourself, patience with difficult people. You start praying for people who hurt you, like, genuinely. Without adding, "and if you could also smite them gently, that'd be great." You pray for your enemies. Not because it makes you holy, but because it makes you free. Like unclenching a fist you forgot was tight. You pray against the lie. You think about Corrie ten Boom. Remember her? The Dutch woman who helped hide Jews during World War II, ended up in a concentration camp, and years later forgave one of her former guards. Historians still argue whether her act of forgiveness was purely divine or psychologically necessary for her survival. Maybe both. Either way, she said forgiveness was not a feeling but an act of the will. A prayer. A choice. And you are making that same choice in tiny, costly, soul-shaping ways. Prayer becomes less of a wish list and more of a war room. A place where you get real. Where you admit, "God, I'm tired of pretending I'm not tired." And surprisingly, the heavens don't shatter. No lightning bolt, just a whisper. "I know, I'm here." You pray while lying face down on the carpet. You pray through tears that stain your hoodie sleeve. You pray when words fail, and your silence feels like the most honest offering you've got. And you realize that maybe treasure isn't always found in answers. Sometimes it's in the not leaving, the staying with, the God who sits with you, even in the doubt. You start praying with people, not just for them. And it's awkward, sure. You stumble, you say weird things like, "Yeah, Lord, just bless stuff." But something sacred happens in the stumble. In the showing up. You pray with your kids. With your spouse. With your friend who's been quietly unraveling. You pray without fanfare, without eloquence. Just real, raw, barely holding it together hope. And somehow that's enough. You realize you don't have to perform for God. You don't have to impress Him. You just have to let Him in. And the treasure? It keeps showing up in strange places, like in the email you dreaded that turns into healing. In the old song that suddenly breaks you open. In the cup of coffee, offered when you needed it most. You remember the desert fathers, early Christian monks who fled to the wilderness to seek solitude with God. Historians still argue whether they were avoiding corruption or simply pursuing deeper holiness. Either way, they believed silence was the soil for revelation. And now, you 21st century digital nomad, are reclaiming that silence. In 5-minute windows, in device-free car rides, in the pause between breaths. You're learning that prayer is less about speaking and more about surrendering. Less about finding the right words, and more about being found. So you whisper, "Search me, God," and He does. And somehow He doesn't flinch. You, the half-believer. The Netflix binging, grace-needing, chronically distracted human, you are seen, and loved, and called precious, because treasure is not earned. It's recognized. It's drawn out, and when you pray, truly pray, you start to see it everywhere, even in you. It hits you on a Tuesday. Or maybe a Sunday. Let's be honest, your days are kind of melting together lately, aren't they? Wingy Tellman. But on this particular not-so-spectacular day, while folding a basket of laundry that seems to multiply like rabbits in the dryer, you feel it. Something sacred. A quiet moment where you realize, this is holy ground. Your living room, your unmade bed, your slightly burned grilled cheese sandwich. Because you've been praying, and now your eyes are different, you start to notice that true treasure, the kind rooted in Christ, is not just waiting for you in eternity. It's slipping into the creases of your now, like the early Christians who gathered in catacombs, worshipping quietly with candlelight and coded symbols. Historians still argue whether their gatherings were strictly out of fear of persecution, or whether the intimacy of underground worship was part of their spiritual design. Either way, those early believers knew something we're only just remembering. You don't need a cathedral to find treasure, you just need presence. You see Christ in the silence between songs, in the slow kindness of an exhausted nurse, in the way your dog looks at you like you're the center of the universe. That's either loyalty or delusion, but hey, it preaches. You're not chasing treasure now, you're catching it. Because powerful prayer, this ongoing conversation you've been stumbling through, has changed you. Not in a flashy, now I glow in the dark way, but in subtle, steady ways. You forgive faster. Kavanason, Kavanasahai Sation, Kavanasahai Sation, Kavanasahais, Kavanasahai Sation, Kavanasahais, Kavanasahais, Kavanasahai Sahai Sation, Kavanasahais, Kavanasahai, Kavanasahais, Kavanasahai Sation, Kavanasahais, 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 Kavanasums without even white-knuckling it first. And then it happens. You pray something like, "God, I trust you with this." And you mean it. Like actually mean it. No asterisk. No backup plan. Just open hands. And sure, 30 minutes later, you might spiral a little. Check your bank account. Google something ridiculous. Eat 2 granola bars back to back. But the prayer holds. Because trust is a muscle, and prayer is how you train it. You're starting to believe that you don't have to have all the answers to rest in God's presence. You can be confused, curious, skeptical, and still be wrapped in love. It's like Moses in the desert, standing barefoot before a bush that won't stop burning. He's hesitant, doubtful, tries to wiggle out of God's plan at least 5 times. And yet, God still calls him, still equips him, still trusts him with treasure. Historians still argue whether the burning bush was a literal fire or a metaphor preserved through oral tradition. Either way, the truth remains. God can use anything to get your attention, even your own frustration, even your unanswered prayers, even your midnight Googling. You start to understand that treasure isn't just something you find, it's something you become. You become peace in a chaotic room. You become joy in someone else's drought. You become an answer to someone's desperate prayer. That coworker you thought was annoying, you start praying for them. That relative who always brings up politics at Thanksgiving. You pray before you respond, or before you throw mashed potatoes. That version of yourself from 5 years ago who was bitter, guarded, afraid of vulnerability. You forgive them too. And now, your prayers are carrying you, sustaining you. They're less like fireworks and more like heartbeat rhythms. Steady, reassuring, constant. You pray while brushing your teeth, while waiting in line, while staring at the ceiling, wondering if anyone else feels this ache you can't quite name. You whisper, "Jesus, be near." And He is. Not always with answers, but always with presence. You realize you've stopped asking for signs, and started listening for whispers. You've stopped comparing your walk with others and started dancing in your own lane, even if it looks more like a limp on most days. You've started seeing treasure in the places you used to rush past, like the quiet moment when your child rests their head on your shoulder, or the way your friend remembers the tiniest details about you, or the warmth of sunlight through the blinds when you needed just one good thing today. You're not perfect, still distracted, still grumpy before coffee, still trying to convince yourself that flossing counts as self-care, but your heart is softer, wiser, open. And you know now that treasure is not hidden in the noise or the hustle. It's found in stillness, in surrender, in the kind of prayer that says, even if nothing changes, I still choose you. So you breathe, and you smile. Because somehow, in this messy, noisy, brilliant life, you've already found what you were looking for.